Harold Finch worked the night shift at Bell Telephone for 11 years. The exchange hummed with relay clicks and tube glow. At 2:17 a.m. on March Tuesday, he reached for a patch cord. His hand slipped, brushing a black socket he never noticed before. It sparked like breaking glass. Suddenly he heard voices. "The assassination proceeds," a man said calmly. November 22, 1963, Dallas. "Motorcade confirmed," a woman replied. "Second shooter on grassy knoll. Patsy eliminated in 48 hours." Harold froze. The date was 6 years future. They spoke of murder like accountants discussing ledgers. He should disconnect. He knew he should, but their precision held him captive. The woman spoke again. "What of the operator?" His heart stopped. "He's listening now," the man said. "Hello, Harold, we've been expecting you." The line went dead. Harold ripped the cord free, hands trembling. Coffee spilled across schematics. He waited for supervisors, police, explanations. No one came. At 6 a.m., he walked home through unchanged streets that felt fundamentally altered. The bakery, the vendor, the schoolchildren, none knew what he knew. The president would die in 6 years. A man named Oswald would be blamed. Harold told no one. Who would believe a telephone operator hearing voices? He would be fired, institutionalized, forgotten. But he couldn't forget. They knew his name. At 8 p.m., he returned early, desperate to find the black socket again. The board was normal, every socket labeled, every cord in place. The black terminal was gone. 3 weeks passed. Harold worked mechanically, connecting calls, listening to strangers without interest. He began to doubt himself. Night work exhaustion, isolation, perhaps a small stroke. Explanations existed for hallucinations that didn't involve time travelers. He was almost convinced he imagined everything when the socket reappeared. Same location, same unlabeled black surface, same sense of wrongness. He stared for 10 minutes, ignoring blinking call lights. Finally, he reached for a cord and inserted it. The connection was immediate, without relay clicks. Same voices, same unnatural clarity. "He's persistent," the woman said, amused. "We expected that, Harold," the man addressed him directly. "You have questions, we have answers, but answers require commitment. Are you prepared?" Harold's mouth was dry. "Who are you?" "We are archivists," the woman replied. "We document fixed points, moments that cannot change without unraveling the weave." "The assassination," Harold whispered. "It cannot be prevented." "It can," the man said, "but prevention would be worse. The alternatives are unpleasant." "We have seen them." Harold thought of the president, young and charismatic, photographed with children. "I don't believe you." "Check tomorrow's newspaper," the woman said. Page 7, obituaries. "Eleanor Vance dies in a fire that hasn't started. Remember her name." The line went dead. Harold disconnected, hands steady with strange resolve. He would buy the newspaper. He would know. Eleanor Vance, 67, retired schoolteacher, perished in a house fire on Maple Street. The article was exactly where they said, page 7, between hardware store closing and wedding announcement. Harold read it 3 times, sitting on his kitchen floor, paper spread across linoleum. The fire started at 3 a.m. Faulty wiring, investigators said. Eleanor was alone, husband dead 10 years, no children. No one to mourn her except students from decades ago. Harold never met her. He had no way of knowing if she deserved death, if it was necessary for some pattern he couldn't perceive. But he knew with cold certainty that the voices told truth. They knew the future. They let him verify. Now they expected something. He returned to the exchange early, before sunset, and waited. The black socket appeared at 9 p.m., earlier than before, responding to his urgency. He connected without hesitation. "What do you want?" he asked. "Observation," the man said. "You have access to a network we cannot penetrate. Telephone system reaches everywhere, touches everyone. We need you to listen." "For what?" "Anomalies," the woman said. "Other voices like ours, others who know what shouldn't be known. They are dangerous, Harold. They change things. We document, they destroy." Harold thought of the power they described, ability to alter history. "And if I refuse, then you will forget," the man said gently. "The conversation, the newspaper, Eleanor Vance. You will wake tomorrow believing you imagined everything. It is painless, most choose this." Harold considered the weight of knowledge or lightness of ignorance. "I need time," he said. "You have until midnight," the woman replied. "The socket will not appear again until you decide." Harold walked the city for 3 hours, watching people who didn't know their futures. A couple arguing in a restaurant. Would they marry, divorce, die in each other's arms? A taxi driver cursing traffic. Would he survive this night, this year, this decade? The unknowability of ordinary life suddenly seemed precious, a gift Harold had lost. He thought of Eleanor Vance, alone in her burning house. Could he have saved her, warned her? The voices said the future was fixed, but also said it could be changed, with consequences. What right did they have to decide which deaths were necessary? What right did he have to know? At 11:47 p.m. he returned to the exchange. The socket waited. I'll listen, he said, but I want something. Name it, the man said, information about my own future. When do I die? Silence on the line, longer than any earthly delay. November 22, 1963, the woman finally said, Dallas, you will attempt to prevent what cannot be prevented. You will succeed only in becoming part of the record. Harold felt the floor tilt, the same date as the assassination, the same city. I'm meant to die there, you are meant to try, the man corrected. The attempt is necessary. The failure is fixed. This is the bargain, Harold. Knowledge without power, sight without agency. Do you accept? Harold thought of Eleanor Vance, of the president, of himself as a footnote in history he couldn't alter. I accept, he said. And the world changed around him, though no one else would notice for 6 years. The work began immediately. Harold received a list of numbers, ordinary exchanges, unremarkable codes to monitor for anomalies. Conversations referencing future events, speakers knowing outcomes before they occurred, callers who shouldn't exist yet or had ceased to exist already. He performed regular duties by rote, attention divided between visible board and hidden frequencies the voices taught him to perceive. It was exhausting, schizophrenic, but exhilarating. He was part of something vast, a network of observers maintaining time's integrity, or so they told him. In April, he detected his first anomaly, a call between two men discussing the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1958, 4 years before it would occur. They spoke of quarantine, of 13 days, of a resolution avoiding nuclear war. Harold recorded details, voices, precise phrasing, and transmitted them through the black socket during next scheduled contact. Neutralized, the woman said after review. The speakers will forget, the crisis will proceed as documented. Harold wanted to ask what neutralized meant, but feared the answer. He continued surveillance. Through summer and fall of 1958, he intercepted 17 anomalous calls. Some were obvious stock tips from 1965, sports results from 1970. Others were subtle, philosophical discussions of events that hadn't happened, technologies that didn't exist. Each time he reported, and each time the voices assured him balance was maintained, but Harold began noticing patterns. The anomalies were increasing. Something was wrong with time itself, a fraying at the edges, and he was patching holes in a dam beginning to crack. In December 1958, Harold intercepted a call that was different. Not two men discussing the future, but one man arguing with himself. The voice was familiar, Harold's own, older, hoarse with age or disease. Don't trust them, future Harold said. They're not archivists, they're gardeners, pruning what doesn't fit their design. Who is this? Present Harold asked, though he knew. You, 1972. I found a way back, a frequency they don't monitor. Listen, Dallas can be changed. The president can live, but you have to. The line dissolved into static, then silence. Harold sat frozen, patch cord still in hand. The voices had warned him of others who would try to change things, but they hadn't warned him that he would become one of them. He didn't report the call. For the first time since recruitment, he kept information from handlers. The betrayal felt like physical weight pressing on his chest. What if future Harold was right? What if the archivists were not preserving history but shaping it, eliminating possibilities threatening their control? He thought of Eleanor Vance, dying alone because her survival would alter some calculation he couldn't comprehend. He thought of himself, destined to die in Dallas, attempting the impossible. The black socket appeared that night without his summons. You heard something, the man said, not a question, an anomaly. I neutralized it. The lie came easily, terrifyingly so. Describe it. Static, nothing coherent. The silence on the line was different this time, evaluative. Harold, the woman said finally, we know your voice better than you do. We heard the call. We know what you were told. The question is whether you believe it. Harold gripped his console. Should I? That is your choice. But choices have consequences. Remember Eleanor Vance. Remember that we warned you. The line went dead. Harold was alone with his doubt and the growing certainty that he was being manipulated by both sides of a war he barely understood. 1959 passed in haze of surveillance and secrecy. Harold continued work for the voices, reporting anomalies, maintaining fiction of loyalty, but he also began his own investigation, using the telephone network they taught him to navigate. He traced calls backward, finding patterns in static, frequencies existing outside official spectrum. He learned to hide his searches, bury inquiries in noise of legitimate traffic. Slowly he constructed a map of what the archivists didn't want him to see. There were others like him, he discovered. Operators in Chicago, London, Tokyo, all recruited through same black sockets, all listening for same anomalies. Some were true believers, content as maintenance workers in time's machinery. Others were dissidents, secretly communicating through coded phrases in ordinary calls, building a resistance they didn't fully understand. Harold made contact with one in March 1960. Sarah Chen, San Francisco Exchange, recruited 1954. She had heard her own future voice in 1958, same warning he received. They want Dallas to happen, she told him through scrambled connection he engineered. The assassination is a fixed point because they fixed it, because something worse happens if he lives. What? Harold asked. We don't know. The future voices won't say. They're afraid, Harold, more afraid than we are. Their conversation lasted 4 minutes before the line was cut, presumably by archivists. Sarah was never heard from again. Her exchange reported her death 2 weeks later, accidental electrocution, faulty equipment. Harold attended her funeral in spirit, standing in his exchange at the moment of her death, listening to silence where her voice had been. He understood then that his own death in Dallas was not prophecy but threat. The archivists were eliminating those who asked too many questions. Harold prepared for Dallas, not by trying to prevent the assassination, that was clearly expected, clearly doomed, but by trying to understand it. He researched the president's schedule, the motorcade route, the security arrangements. All public information, available to anyone with patience and a library card, but he also used his access to listen. Calls between Secret Service, between Dallas police, between men whose voices he didn't recognize but whose tone suggested knowledge beyond their apparent roles. He built a picture of November 22, 1963, as a nexus, a point where multiple futures converged and collapsed into one. The archivists wanted this future. Other forces wanted others. And Harold, caught in the middle, was trying to find a third path. In October 1963, he received a final call from his future self. The voice was weaker now, desperate. I've tried everything, every variation. He dies or something worse follows. Nuclear war in 64, civil war in 65, millions dead. The archivists are right about the consequences, wrong about the cause. It's not about preserving history. It's about preserving their power. They could save him. They choose not to. What do I do? Harold asked. Survive. That's all I've found. Don't go to Dallas. Refuse the assignment. Live to 1972, to 1980, to whatever comes next. The only victory is outlasting them. And if I can't refuse, then die knowing you tried. That's more than I managed. The line dissolved, and Harold knew he would never hear that voice again. His future self had exhausted his timeline, spent his possibilities. Now it was present Harold's turn to choose. He sat in the humming exchange, surrounded by strangers' voices, and made his decision. He would go to Dallas. But not to save the president, to save himself, and to learn what the archivists were truly protecting. November 21, 1963. Harold arrived in Dallas by bus, traveling under a false name he established through contacts in the resistance. He carried no weapons, no evidence, only a small radio receiver tuned to frequencies the archivists used for communication. He had learned to perceive their signals, the patterns beneath static, and he hoped to intercept their coordination of the assassination. He checked into a motel near Dealey Plaza, the location he had heard described so many times in anomalous calls. The room smelled of cigarettes and desperation. He didn't sleep. At 8 a.m. on November 22, he positioned himself on the grassy knoll, the location the archivists had mentioned as the second shooter's position. He was early. The motorcade wouldn't pass for 3 hours. He watched the plaza fill with spectators, ordinary people anticipating a glimpse of history. He wanted to warn them, to scatter them, but knew it would accomplish nothing. The archivists had predicted his presence. They had prepared for interference. At 12:15, he heard their signal in his earpiece. Subject approaching, all positions confirm. Harold looked around, trying to identify the speakers. He saw a man with an umbrella, though it wasn't raining. A woman with a camera, too professional for a tourist. And on the 6th floor of the book depository, a window open, a shape that might have been a rifle. He began to run toward the depository, knowing it was futile, knowing he was playing the role they had written for him. The first shot rang out as he reached the building's entrance. He didn't hear the second. He was already inside, climbing stairs, searching for a shooter he knew he wouldn't find in time. The book depository was empty on the 6th floor. The rifle lay discarded, fingerprints that would match a man named Oswald, a trail of evidence so perfect it could only have been manufactured. Harold heard the chaos outside, the screaming, the sirens beginning their wail. He went to the window and looked down at the plaza. The presidential limousine was gone, racing toward the hospital. People were running in all directions, some toward the knoll, some away, a human wave of panic and confusion. On the grassy knoll where he had stood, the man with the umbrella was calmly folding his device, his mission complete. Their eyes met across the distance. The man smiled, raised his hand in a small wave. He knew Harold. He had been expecting him. Harold ran down the stairs, out the back exit, into the alley where a police car was already arriving. He was arrested within minutes, a suspicious figure fleeing the scene, his radio receiver confiscated as evidence of conspiracy. In the police station, he gave his false name, his false story, waited for the archivists to intervene. They didn't. He was a loose end now, a witness who had seen too much but accomplished nothing. He sat in his cell, listening to the news reports, the confirmation of death, the arrest of Oswald, everything as predicted, everything as fixed. On November 24, while being transferred between facilities, Harold escaped. Not through his own skill. His guards were conveniently distracted, doors left unlocked, a vehicle with keys in the ignition. The archivists were releasing him, or someone was. He drove west, toward New Mexico, toward the desert where radio signals were weak and the future felt distant. He had survived Dallas contrary to prophecy. But he had learned nothing, changed nothing, saved no one. The victory felt like defeat. Harold lived in the desert for 6 years, working as a mechanic in a town too small to appear on most maps. He changed his name again, buried his past, tried to forget the voices in the wires, but the wires found him. In 1969, a telephone was installed in the garage where he worked, and on its first day of operation, it rang with no one on the other end. Only static and then the familiar voices. "You've been difficult to locate," the woman said. "We thought you might prefer retirement." "You tried to kill me," Harold said. "In Dallas, you predicted my death." "We predicted your attempt," the man corrected. "Your survival was unexpected, but not unwelcome. You've proven resourceful. We have new work for you." Harold gripped the receiver, remembering Sarah Chen, remembering his future self's warning. "I won't help you anymore. You misunderstand. This isn't a request. The anomaly rate has increased exponentially. The system is failing. We need experienced operators to help contain the breach." "What breach?" "The future is leaking, Harold. Too many voices, too many travelers, too many who have learned what you learned. The dam is breaking. We need to evacuate the archives." Harold laughed, a sound he hadn't made in years. Evacuate to where? To the past. To before the telephone, before the networks, before the possibilities multiplied. "We are going to 1890, Harold, and we want you to operate the switchboard." The absurdity was complete. The archivists, masters of time, were retreating to a world without electronics, without the infrastructure that had made their surveillance possible. They were admitting defeat, and they wanted him to join their retreat. Harold refused. He smashed the telephone, destroyed the switchboard, walked into the desert, and didn't stop until his shoes fell apart. He lived with a Navajo family for 2 months, learning their language, their stories of time as a circle rather than a line. When he returned to civilization, it was 1970, and the world had changed in ways he couldn't articulate. The archivist's influence was fading. He could feel it in the quality of static, the absence of certain frequencies. They were leaving, withdrawing to their 1890 sanctuary, abandoning the 20th century to its own chaos. He was free, truly free, for the first time since 1957. He returned to the telephone exchange in his original city, now automated, computerized, the human operators replaced by machines. He found employment as a night watchman, walking the empty halls where he had once connected the world. The black sockets were gone, the voices silent. He was an old man now, 62, his hands stiff with arthritis, his memory unreliable. He began to doubt that any of it had happened. The mind plays tricks, especially in isolation, especially with sleep deprivation. Perhaps he had imagined the archivists, the future voices, his own death in Dallas. Perhaps he was simply a man who had worked a job and grown old. Then in 1972, he found the recording. Reel-to-reel tape, hidden in a wall panel during the exchange's renovation, dated 1957 in his own handwriting. He played it on an old machine and heard his voice, young, terrified, speaking to the archivists about Eleanor Vance, about Dallas, about his own death. The proof existed. The madness was real. He sat in the dark exchange, listening to his younger self negotiate with monsters, and wept for the life he had lost, the ordinary future he had sacrificed to a war he still didn't understand. The recording contained more than Harold remembered. Interspersed with his conversations with the archivists were other voices, other frequencies, a cacophony of time travelers, prophets, and madmen, all broadcasting through the same impossible network. He heard warnings about wars that hadn't happened, plagues that had been prevented, technological marvels and horrors that lay in futures he would never see. He heard Sarah Chen's voice briefly, describing her own death. He heard his future self, the 1972 version, weaker than the voice he had spoken to in 1958, suggesting that multiple timelines were collapsing into one. And he heard something else. The archivists' true names, their point of origin, the reason they feared the future they claimed to document. They were not from the future, Harold realized. They were from a future, one of many, trying to preserve their specific timeline against the encroachment of alternatives. Their archives were not records but weapons, tools for eliminating competing histories. And Harold had been their unwitting executioner, helping them prune possibilities until only their preferred reality remained. He spent 6 months analyzing the recording, correlating dates, building a theory of what had happened to him and to the world. The archivists had retreated to 1890, but their influence lingered. The 20th century had been shaped by their interventions, guided toward outcomes that benefited their timeline. The wars, the assassinations, the technological developments, all potentially manipulated, optimized for a future Harold couldn't imagine. He made a decision: if he couldn't change the past, he could at least document it. He began writing his memoirs, hiding copies in safe deposit boxes, mailing them to strangers, encoding them in advertisements and crossword puzzles. The truth would survive, fragmented but persistent, waiting for someone to assemble it. 1975, Harold was 67, living in a veteran's home despite never having served, his false histories catching up with him. He had distributed his memoirs widely enough that he felt secure. The truth was beyond anyone's power to fully suppress, but he was lonely, isolated by knowledge that no one else shared. The other residents talked about television, about grandchildren, about the weather. Harold talked about time travelers and was politely ignored. Then a young man visited him. 25 years old, intense eyes, a recorder in his hand. "Mr. Finch, I'm David Webb. I'm researching the history of telephone networks. I found your name in some unusual documents." Harold studied him, searching for signs of archivist manipulation. The young man seemed genuine, curious, unafraid. "What documents?" "Letters. Hidden in archives across the country, all describing the same thing: a black socket, voices from the future, a conspiracy to control history. Most people think they're fiction." "I think there's something else." Harold smiled for the first time in years. "You have questions, I have hundreds. Ask one." David paused, consulting his notes. "Did you save anything?" "Proof that would convince a skeptic." Harold reached under his mattress, retrieved the reel-to-reel tape. "This, recorded 1957, contains conversations with entities who knew the future, including the assassination of President Kennedy 6 years before it occurred." David held the tape as if it were radioactive. "Can I play it?" "Not here. They watch places like this. Old people, forgotten people, easy to silence. But I'll tell you where: a telephone museum in New Jersey. They have equipment from the 1950s, functional, isolated from modern networks. You can hear it there. And then you can decide what to do with the knowledge." David nodded, serious beyond his years. "Why me? Why now?" "Because you're the first who asked," Harold said. "The archivists are gone, but their system remains. Someone need." David Webb played the tape in the New Jersey Museum, surrounded by obsolete technology that suddenly seemed alive with possibility. He heard everything: the archivist's calm pronouncements, Harold's terror, the prophecy of Dallas. He made copies, hid the original, began his own investigation. Harold died in 1976, peacefully, his memoirs incomplete but distributed widely enough to survive. David became their curator, their interpreter, their apostle. He spent the 1980s and 1990s tracking down other operators, other survivors of the archivist program. He found 3. A woman in Tokyo who had refused recruitment and lived with the knowledge, a man in London who had accepted and regretted, a teenager in Sao Paulo who had intercepted anomalous calls on a cellular network the archivists hadn't anticipated. Together, they built a network of their own, watching for signs of the archivist's return, documenting the continued anomalies that suggested the system was still functioning without its creators. The internet changed everything. Where the telephone network had been limited, controllable, the digital realm was infinite, chaotic, impossible to fully monitor. David saw this as opportunity, a space where the archivist's influence couldn't reach, where alternative futures could develop without pruning. He established websites, encrypted forums, dark web repositories where the truth about time manipulation could be shared without censorship. The community grew slowly: skeptics and believers, scientists and mystics, all drawn by the same evidence Harold had gathered decades earlier. In 2003, David received a message through his own system, encoded in the patterns of a distributed denial-of-service attack. "We see you," it said. "We are returning. Will you help or hinder?" The archivists were coming back. And they were offering a choice. David was 63 in 2011, his hair white, his hands trembling with Parkinson's disease. The archivists had not returned in any form he could recognize, but the anomalies continued. Predictions of terrorist attacks, of natural disasters, of political outcomes that arrived with unnatural precision in online forums and encrypted messages. Someone was still watching, still documenting, still occasionally pruning. The technology had evolved beyond telephone exchanges. Now the network was everywhere, in phones and computers and smart devices, a web of surveillance that made the 1950s system seem primitive. David had married, divorced, raised a daughter who thought he was eccentric and possibly insane. He had never told her the full truth, protecting her from the burden of knowledge that had defined his life. But in 2011, he received a medical diagnosis that clarified his remaining time. 6 months, perhaps a year. The Parkinson's was advancing. His mind would follow his body into decay. He made a decision. He would create one final record, comprehensive, undeniable, distributed so widely that no amount of pruning could eliminate it. He would tell the whole story. Harold Finch, the Black Socket, the archivists, his own decades of research. He would embed it in blockchain, in satellite transmissions, in the genetic code of bacteria engineered for longevity. The truth would become part of the world's infrastructure, ineradicable. As he worked, he felt the old familiar sensation of being watched, not by the archivists, something different, something newer. The future, perhaps looking back at him through the same interface he had spent his life trying to understand. He wrote in his final entry, "I don't know if this will survive. I don't know if anyone will believe it. But I know that Harold Finch existed, that he heard what he heard, that he tried to warn us. I am his proof, and soon I will be his companion in whatever comes next. The call is ending. The line is going." David died in 2012. His distributed archive survived, fragments appearing in unexpected places. A blockchain transaction in 2017 containing a compressed version of his memoirs, a satellite transmission received by amateur radio operators in 2019, a bacterial strain discovered in 2021 with DNA encoding a photograph of Harold Finch. The community he had built continued, evolved, became something he hadn't anticipated. They called themselves operators now, in tribute to the original telephone workers who had first intercepted the future. They monitored global communications for anomalies, maintained the records of the archivists' interventions, prepared for the return that David had predicted. In 2023, they detected a signal. Not in telephone wires or internet packets, but in quantum entanglement itself. Patterns of correlation that suggested information traveling backward through time, the same impossible communication that Harold had first intercepted in 1957. The archivists were returning, not to 1890 as they had planned, but to the quantum realm, a substrate beneath physical reality where all times existed simultaneously. The operators faced a choice. They could try to block the return, to sever the connection at its source. Or they could negotiate, learn what the archivists had discovered in their decades of retreat, perhaps find a way to coexist with the guardians of history. A young woman named Maya Chen, descendant of Sarah Chen, the operator who had died in 1958, led the contact team. She had grown up with David's stories, trained in the techniques he had developed, prepared for this moment her entire life. On March 15, 2023, she initiated communication. "We are the operators," she transmitted through the quantum interface. "We know what you are, we know what you've done. We want to talk." The response was immediate, familiar, terrifying in its calm. "Hello, Maya, we've been expecting you." The negotiation lasted 3 years. Maya learned that the archivists had not been idle in their quantum sanctuary. They had evolved, become something closer to information than flesh, capable of perceiving all timelines simultaneously, but unable to affect any of them directly. They needed operators, human intermediaries, to implement their designs, to prune the possibilities that threatened their preferred future. In exchange, they offered knowledge. Cures for diseases, solutions to climate change, warnings of disasters that could be prevented. It was the same bargain they had offered Harold Finch in 1957, updated for a new millennium. Maya refused. Not out of moral certainty, she understood the complexity of their position, the genuine belief that they were protecting humanity from worse outcomes, but out of hope. She believed that the future should be unwritten, that the chaos of free choice was preferable to the security of control. She believed that Harold had died for this principle, that David had spent his life defending it, that she owed them continuity rather than surrender. The archivists were not angry. They had seen her refusal before in countless timelines, and they had seen her acceptance. Both paths led to interesting outcomes, both contributed to their archives. They withdrew, not defeated but patient, waiting for the next generation of operators who might choose differently. Maya returned to the physical world, to her community, to the ongoing work of monitoring and documenting. She had bought time, nothing more. The fundamental conflict remained, those who would preserve history versus those who would allow it to change. She thought of Harold often, the lonely night shift worker who had answered a call not meant for him, who had listened when he should have disconnected, who had started everything with a single moment of curiosity. She wished she could tell him that it mattered, that his courage had cascaded through decades, that his name was remembered. 2057, the centennial of Harold Finch's first interception. Maya was 89, the last surviving operator who had known David Webb personally. The community had grown to thousands, distributed across the globe, connected by technologies that made the telephone exchange seem like a child's toy. They had detected no archivist activity for 30 years. Perhaps they had given up, found other timelines to cultivate, other realities to prune. Perhaps they had become so subtle that their interventions were undetectable. Or perhaps, and this was Maya's private belief, they had become obsolete. The future was leaking through a million channels now, not controlled by any single network. Predictions appeared in dreams, in drug experiences, in the random patterns of cosmic radiation. Everyone knew something of what was coming, and the knowledge had lost its power to control. Maya spent her final years organizing the archives, ensuring that Harold's story would survive in forms accessible to any future generation. She recorded her own memoirs, added them to the distributed database, became part of the chain of testimony that stretched back to 1957. On the anniversary of Harold's first call, she sat in a museum exhibit, a recreation of the Bell telephone exchange, complete with vintage equipment and a functional switchboard. She connected a patch cord, heard the familiar click of relays, and spoke into the dead line. "Hello, Harold, thank you for listening." The line was silent, as she knew it would be, but for a moment, just a moment, she felt something. A presence, a attention, a voice that might have been her own or might have been his, whispering across the decades, "We've been expecting you." Maya smiled, disconnected the cord, and walked into the afternoon light. The future was unwritten. The past was alive, the call would continue, through other hands, other ears, other hearts brave enough to listen. The line never truly went dead, it only waited, humming with possibility.